significant with 95% confidence. For the 1960s, the correlation between social spending and the GDP level by the end of the decade is plus 0.65 and is again statistically significant, this time with 99% confidence. The correlation between GDP growth and social spending from 2007 to 2014 is minus 0.09 and is not statistically significant. In fact, looking first at the column for GDP growth rates, you can see that none of the correlations are statistically significant. The values are slightly negative on average, but this is likely just noise. It seems that the growth of GDP and social spending do not have an obvious relationship from this data. Looking at the second and third columns, we can see that the correlations are universally positive, and many of them are statistically significant. This implies that social spending has a positive relationship with the overall GDP level, both on a year-by-year basis and on a decade-by-decade basis. I wouldn't read too much into this positive effect, though. The important point is that the purported catastrophic negative effects of social spending just aren't easily visible. These are just simple correlations, but if there were a negative correlation between GDP and social spending, I could at least see where critics of social spending got their views from. Even with this low bar, there are just no obvious negative effects or examples of it holding countries back. This remains true if you try to correlate social spending with employment levels, self-reported happiness, or play with other measures. Yet investment in healthcare and education has led to longer, happier, and more productive lives for millions of people the world over. Still, this is just a starting point. We'll need to look at more in-depth evidence before we conclude that free stuff is good actually. By the way, I'll be using free stuff, social spending, and government spending somewhat interchangeably in this video. Governments have a unique role within economies. Unlike private companies, individuals, unions, or even local governments, national governments have a stake in a wide range of social and economic outcomes. This means that spending on education, health, and welfare can have knock-on effects, which ultimately benefit society and the government down the line. In some cases, the eventual benefits will even outweigh the costs of the original spending. Governments are also uniquely positioned to fund such programs and distribute them to the entire population, free at the point of use. At the start of the video, I said there are two main reasons to love social spending. First, it makes long-term investments in things like universal education, childcare, and healthcare on a scale that the private sector won't. Secondly, it provides social insurance for the population against risks to their health and standard of living more generally. It does this in a more efficient and comprehensive way than the private sector can. Let's explore each of these in turn. I'm going to use three main examples of social spending: education, healthcare, and welfare payments like universal basic income. And we're going to do things in that order. So yes, this video has quite a lot of content, but there are plenty of Simpsons clips to break it up.
Have some money.
In 1807, a bill to extend education to the poor was proposed in UK Parliament. The Tory MP, Davies Giddy, spoke out against it.
Giving education to the labouring classes of the poor would, in effect, be found to be prejudicial to their morals and happiness. It would teach them to despise their lot in life, instead of making them good servants in agriculture and other laborious employments to which their rank in society had destined them. Instead of teaching them subordination, it would render them factious and refractory, as was evident in the manufacturing counties. It would enable them to read seditious pamphlets, vicious books, and publications against Christianity. It would render them insolent to their superiors.
I like how this guy's portrait perfectly fits his political views. That feeling when you take things from the poor, lol. Giddy was right about some things. Education allowed workers to leave agriculture and get jobs in manufacturing. It tended to reduce support for Tories, and it probably aided the decline of religion. But he was wrong when he said,
Besides, if the bill were to pass into a law, it would go to burthen the country with a most enormous and incalculable expense, and to load the industrious orders of society with still heavier imposts.
Firstly, the taxes themselves were only 0.2% of national income, an eminently affordable sum. Secondly, estimates from back then show that educating the poor would have been a wise investment which likely paid for itself in the long run. This table shows estimates of the rates of return on schooling for the sons of labourers in Victorian England. These are in percentages, the extra money received from paying for your son's education through their eventual higher earnings. The columns show the different parties who might benefit from this investment. We are most interested in the second column, which shows the rate of return for a private family investing in schooling, and the fourth column, which shows the rate of return for the government investing in schooling. As the table states, the first 3 years of schooling would have achieved signature literacy. Men are called grooms here for some reason, and the dates on the far right are when these grooms started schools as sons. It's a little confusing, but it's cool data, so let's stick with it. A private family investing in 3 years of schooling for its son in 1821 yielded a 19.5% return by 1840 when the son was a grown-up groom. For sons who started school in 1842, the return was 11% by 1868. These boys would benefit massively from having their education invested in, as it increased their future earnings by over 10% in each case. What's also interesting here is the fourth column, which shows the fiscal return to the government. The government could expect a 21.2% rate of return from investing in schooling in 1821 and a 6.5% rate of return for investing in schooling in 1842. This is because higher earnings for the sons meant higher tax income for the government once the sons grew up and became grooms. As the fifth column shows, these rates of return were much higher than government borrowing costs. Education paid for itself, even if the government had to borrow to invest in that education. Education benefited the children who got it and their families, and also benefited the government who paid for it. Davis Giddy was incorrect that this was unaffordable. That's right. A Tory MP was both callous and wrong. I'll give you a minute to process that revelation. You could even say that Davies was giddy to deny education to the masses. I'll show myself out. The economist Milton Friedman used to say, "There's no such thing as a free lunch."
It's the free lunch myth. The belief that somehow or other government can spend money at nobody's expense.
The idea is that if you spend money on something like public education, then you have to pay for it, which involves taxes, which are a drag on the economy. Friedman enjoyed quoting the 19th century economist Friedrich Bastiat.
I don't know how many of you have ever heard of a wonderful description of government that was made by a French economist by the name of Frédéric Bastiat about 150 years ago. He said, "Government is that fiction whereby everybody believes that he can live at the expense of everybody else." The insight that education can pay for itself reframes our view of public spending. Public education enables people to lead better lives through learning and basic skills. It increases income for individuals and their families. On top of all this, from the perspective of governments, public education pays for itself through higher future taxes, contradicting Friedman's dictum. Peter Linder presents this simple historical diagram of how investment in education yields returns. In the past, countries lacked the fiscal capacity and political will to use tax money to extend education to the entire population. That's link A on the diagram. As a race, that is, humanity, we managed this much later than we needed to. Selfish elites kept education from the masses for tens or even hundreds of years longer than necessitated by a lack of resources and knowledge. Once we began to spend money on education, the average years of schooling went up. That's link B on the diagram. Once years of schooling went up, so did the skills and knowledge of the population, or link C. And once the skills and knowledge of the population increased, so did their productivity and earning power. That's link D. This virtuous cycle also meant higher tax revenues for the governments that invested in the first place. We found the free lunch. All we needed to do was ensure universal provision of education to children. And if you think this only applies to early education in Victorian Britain, then you're going to be so embarrassed when I say what I'm about to say right now. It doesn't only apply to early education in Victorian Britain. Could have improved that script, didn't. There are plenty of other examples from across the globe. Linda highlights that Eastern European countries have roughly similar average incomes to Latin American countries, but due to higher spending on education, they tend to outperform Latin America on test scores. Education in the USA deserves singling out because it lags behind other education systems despite the high average income of the country. It may be the case that low funding is leaving a free lunch on the table for America.
As well as not giving many children, disproportionately poor and or non-white, a good chance in life, the low funding per person in the USA could yield dividends if the government chose to invest more. To be